Hello, my name is Holo74, and today I will be showing you how to make a superior player controller. This player controller will be able to take in different states, run different actions, and overall it's slightly, it's better. So the first thing we'll do is we'll pop in the first thing is we start a new project. This is a 3D scene, or 3D template, and within it we'll create a capsule with a character controller on it. From there you want to organize everything properly, so that way if anyone else tries to use it, or if you're just coming back around to it, you know where everything is located. Which is why when you create a scripts folder, you don't just throw everything in, you create subfolders. I like to create a player folder to store most of my players' actions. Now, within programming, you might want to create controllers for certain things. A controller will dictate one thing and how it behaves. So for this, we're using a player controller. Usually a manager, on the other hand, would dictate how there would be only one instance of it. A handler is subtypes of a controller. That's how I like to think of it. So that's how my naming scheme. With the player controller, you want to take in, or first you want to do a namespace. Namespaces, not necessarily easily, but they divide all your scripts up so that you're not seeing them all at once. And if you know exactly where you're going to use, well then, let's say I want to use a controller. So I'll do using holo74.controller. Now if I wanted a more specific one, I could say player. However, well, you could use it, but over time it might get a little bit more tedious and you might be implementing many controllers all at once. However, controllers, I would say, deserve their third name, such as player right here, because controllers typically only exist as one, whereas a handler would probably only reside up here as holo74.handler. So within this, we'll get rid of the comments, and for if you're using a character controller, then we'll do private character controller. Now, the name for this it does matter. I like to go with controller just because this is a player controller, and this is the main controller for it. You could name it better. As I've been told many times before, my name schemes kind of suck. However, that's the beauty of programming and styles. So right here, this could be player controller, handler, well not handler. Anything that you'll easily remember or know what it means. So in awake, usually awakes, I use them for getting components, because they only run one instance and they run before anything else, unless you do some trickery, in which case you break things, but that usually happens with a scene change. So in controller, we now have this. What we can do here to make this public to everything and instead of just going public, which usually is very bad, mainly because the more things are public, the more things can break. The best thing to do for this would just be get private set. Now what this does is it allows for you to get this variable without ever having to, or ever being able to set it. Meaning if I had another script that if I went in and I said, oh, I want the controller to equal this now, through maybe a handler or something, it wouldn't be able to do that unless I created a function in here which dictated how you change that. Such as, let's say, private, or not private, because then that we wouldn't be able to get. So public void change controller. And in here, you would take a character controller, and usually if the variable that I'm modifying, I like to put a underscore, mainly because then instead of doing this dot controller, I can just do controller equals underscore controller. So I'll still be using the same name scheming, I just know that the underscore comes from a function variable rather than a class. So now that we have this, we can go back out and say, let's create a walking controller, or walking handler, I should say. This one will dictate how the player walks throughout the scene. With this walking handler, with a walking handler, you also want an input handler. Usually, with a input handler, you can make an abstract class, and from there you can implement it into a walking handler or implement it into other classes that take input. Put handler. Now, naming it handler might not be the best thing, simply because a input handler, there would generally be one instance of it, whereas this one, if we make an abstract class with a bunch of different variables, it might not go over too well. So instead of input handler, we could go with input abstract, or general. That might be a better name, though naming is an art of its own. So with this abstract class, a input handler, you won't necessarily need a mono behavior. The reason for that is input can be got through its own methods, such as if you implement something that is always up. Well, it's better to show this. Hello 74 dot. Let's do generals. Now, it's better to also name this as a plural instead of a singular, simply because, for me at least, I name most of my classes in the singular. Unfortunately, there has been time where I've named it in the plural, and it's created a much bigger hassle than needed. So public abstract, since we want this to be an iteration of other things. So for this we could do private key codes, an array of key codes, because with each input, or each input general being used as an abstract, you might have different uses, meaning when you're underwater, you might not want to have the ability to lean off to the side, but you can. And in that case, instead of using a walking handler, you'd you would use a walking handler with different variable types. However, if you're on like a horse or if you're in a car, you might want to have some different controls on how everything's being used. That, or you could just have an array somewhere else in a static variables that gives you all the possible key codes. So for now, I'll just do all inputs. Close it off. Equals, let's see, new key code. I can't remember how to do this. Yep, okay. So when you do something like this, it essentially creates a new array and puts in all the possible things. Now, what might be better is to have this in a the inspector and maybe the player controller, where instead of getting all the key codes right here, for the player controller in here, you can just do public private. This one you would do private, simply because if you were to do this public character controller, the inspector wouldn't show it. Key codes, all inputs. Whoops. And down here you would put serialized field. However, we also want to have access to this, which means we would have a public key code, an array, get inputs, return all inputs. So, whoops, I forgot the two brackets. So with this, we can now go over, since it's a public, we can do private player controller and main controller. From here we can do, we can have our solve that and do public input general, and from here we would want a player controller. So whenever we make a new type of this, or new input general, we would request a main controller or the player controller and set it the main controller equal to the main controller. So that way when we come down here and say public void getting inputs, we can just simply say if or main controller dot get all get inputs. We can do this, or we can do public key code and get a singular key code. Get key, yes, and then you could either do a int string, a float, that'd be really bad, or you can come up here and do an enum, or however you pronounce that, enum, key list. What an enum is essentially it's a lot of ints. So let's say move forward key. Now the move forward would be 0. Let's close this off so we don't get errors. But what we can do is we can do key list instead, and we can say key type, return all inputs, and we can do key type. Or maybe not. I would say to do a casting to an int, but casting isn't the most efficient, actually. Yeah, we can probably just do that. Return all inputs key type. Let's see, can I convert key list? It seems to want to cast it, which might be good for the time being. However, I wouldn't recommend doing it in the long run. So now we can get over here and say get input, get key dot move forward. Cut that. Input dot get key, and you can do get key down, which get key down would only return the moment or the frame that you hit the key, whereas this one, it generally just it gets it every single frame that it's being held down. That's what I should say. So with this, we can reference to the main controller and all the possible keys, which if we head out here and connect the player controller, or wait for it to hit it, but connect the player controller, you can see in here all inputs. Let's make it size of 1, and let's say we want an A for left, or rather just do W. So now in the key inputs, or all the inputs, you have W as one of them. And if you want to add more, you can just be like, yeah, I want 10 of them, and assign each one to a new variable. With this, let's say you want each input general to handle inputs in a significantly different way. What you can then do is each time you iterate, you make an abstract. With making it an abstract, every time that you create it, let's go over back to this. Oops, wrong one. Let's say the walking handler. Walking handler implements input general into that. Solve it by importing generals. Now it has a red squiggly line underneath. That means it's missing a abstract class. So every time you come in here, make this a part of it, or attach the class, then you'll have to input this. Right. So it seems as though we can't necessarily, from what I can see, implement something like this. However, I've also realized that we needed to make the the player controller a protected class so we can have access to it. Now, this still needs to be abstract rather than an interface, simply because we have a variable here. And that variable extends out to every instance of it. However, since we can't do it in the master or the abstract class, we'll want to assign it here. Player controller, main controller. Consistent naming is essentially key equals main controller. Alright. Now in here, it might also be good to have a list of input handlers. So we'll make this a private list because we might add on more classes, we might remove some, or we might have a list of these, or not necessarily a list, but we can have a array of them. If I can spell, general array. Good God. Generals, all input. Wait, no. Input handlers, or generals, because that's good enough. Equals. Here we can say new walking handler. This. Actually, we cannot. Okay. Equals new input generals, and we'll want to say 2 for now, because we'll have a different instance of walking. So with this, we can also say in here, maybe there's a certain speed that we can go at. Let's say public, or not public, private float main speed. This is where what every other speed derives off of. And we'll assign it here as well. Float main speed. So when we call in this class, we'll have to call in both speed and a player controller. Whoops. Main speed equals main speed. And here, getting inputs. What I like to do for this is make a different function for each input, so that way everything's organized and there's proper names. Let's do a private void. Let's see. Input W, or input 0, or forward actually. That's a better name. Whoops. Oh dear. No, that's not what you want. So input forward, which you would then put in here. And in the main player controller, depending on which state you're in, such as in player states, you might have a crouch and a standing state for the player, which, let's see, private void input handling And since the input handling is part of this class, you will just throw it right into the update instead of passing through anything. Actually, while we've created the list, we'll also need the own player state for the player controller. So we'll do a private player state current state, and the current state equals player. that you default to, in this one at least, will be standing. Switch. Now if you press or double tap tab, you'll auto-complete it, which is really nice when you just want to slide in the current states, press the down arrow, and it automatically fills in everything. With crouching, we'll put in input general dot, or input general 0 dot get inputs. Now with this, every time the reason for this abstract class is so we could have this. With that, you could run everything through and update it every frame. Let's do input generals 1 as well, not get inputs. Let's say input generals 0 equals new walking handler with this, and the main speed will be 0.05f. Now we can also copy this, go through 1. The reason that this isn't start is because it will run after, and if we need to get any components for it, then we'll have already gotten them in the awake function. Or what you could do is you could have, well actually no, when you start up the player, you'll have a different function from a game manager. However, that will be a little bit later. Alright, so I believe we can end it here. This is a simple setup that can lead to, from what I believe will be a better workflow. If you implement this workflow, you'll be able to have several iterations of different inputs rather than having to modify them in a single input class. I've had to do multiple times over before. One input class, and then it started getting really messy as I had different states, and then those different states needed different methods of handling. With this, you could copy over all the inputs, and as long as you know how much or how many of the inputs are in, and you comment right and you plan ahead, you'll be able to simply send in all the inputs through this player enum, or this key list. And the good thing with this key list is, well, the enum at least, is instead of having to remember all the integers or strings, you can just simply send in, I want a certain input. So that will be it for now. Next time we'll elaborate on this walking handler, get some basic inputs, create two different types, or not, well, yes, we'll create swimming along with or finish off this. The third one, if we have time, well, the third tutorial will most likely be on leaning and how to get that, because it took me several hours on how to figure that out. Thank you all for stopping by, and I'll hope to see you next time.